You're listening to the South and Sideways podcast on the Urban Sentinel channel. I am your host, the Urban Sentinel. This is podcast episode 08, Gun Control. Let's get into it. It's got 2 words, 3 syllables, and can start a firestorm. Gun control. I'm going to dive into the deep end and discuss what it really means, and for those of you listening and don't know, why it may not be that bad. Here in America, we have a love of many things. Fried food, fast cars, loud music, cold beer, and guns. Fair enough to say they can all do some real damage if you're not careful. Speaking on the main topic, firearms are a part of our foundation in the building of this nation. They are enshrined within the fabric of our Constitution, yet somehow, in modern times, their very position, the Second Amendment, has become the red-headed stepchild in the family photo. Now, I will do my best to delineate between actual facts and my opinion on those facts as I continue. And a quick warning for those of you who haven't listened to one of my podcasts before, when I continue talking for a long time nonstop, my voice changes a bit, as I was diagnosed back in the late 70s with a condition known as chronic sarcasm. It's a benign form of facetiousness, and I've lived with it my entire life, but I will not let my disability hold me back. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That is a war cry. That is a steel gauntlet thrown down as a challenge. That is a double dog dare you. Now, let's take into account the framers of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution did not, under any means, just whip up these documents over an all-nighter at the Tun Tavern. No, the very basis to which all of these articles were written were in fact formed by and under the very conditions of systemic oppression. King George III was an authoritarian, tyrannical, dictatorial ruler. Through his edicts carried out by his numerous barristers and magistrates and favored governors, the unfair and unlawful orders were enforced upon the citizenry by the Redcoats, which were the standing army that acted as a police force for the monarchy. When you read through the amendments, each one is in direct response to some actions taken by the crown against the people. Please take into account that the British Empire was a vast, sprawling, dominant force in the world, but you were either a subject, a servant, or a slave to the crown. Although the Founding Fathers did not explicitly state the order of the amendments was of any significant importance, you must concede that if you intend to demand redress of grievances from your oppressive government as your first right, then, when they, the government, send forward their standing army to police and enforce the king's laws upon the protesters, being able to keep and bear arms may possibly be a very good choice for your number 2 spot on that list. Side note, and there will be many of these, the British muskets had an average range of about 100 yards, striking a target within a 3-foot radius. The muskets could reach out to almost 300 yards, but that was more for a large volley for effect. The colonial army muskets ranged between 80 to 100 yards, maxing out at about 150-175, for the same level of accuracy. Many civilians that were never soldiers and never part of the colonial army used a musket that is more akin to a shotgun rather than effectively a rifle. But after the French joined the revolution and sided with the revolutionaries, plenty of French muskets then made their way into the hands of the colonial army as well as the citizens in the 13 colonies. From effectively 1780 to 1934, there were no real government regulations of firearms for civilians versus the government, the military. People did own cannons. People owned the same exact service rifles and machine guns as soldiers in World War I. What changed was the crackdown of organized crime and the prohibition of weapons that gangsters may use. It was not because the government didn't think nobody needs a Tommy gun or a BAR. They simply wanted to reduce the chances of their G-men being outgunned by the criminals. From that point forward, things got down to a slippery slope. During the periods after 1865 all the way to 1965, that's 100 years, there were many state, county, and local laws and ordinances regulated where firearms could be carried and by whom. The primary focus was to ensure the Negro wasn't armed wherever he went. Sure, a sharecropper out on a back 40 could have a shotgun, a cattleman out on the plains could have a rifle, but a black man living in the city limits, keeping a pistol on him for self-defense, that was a high hurdle to get over. Most of the gun control laws in this country were written to deter criminals from shooting it out with law enforcement and to prevent minority groups, being black, being of Mexican descent if you're in the Southwest area, being able to defend themselves. When you think about this example, and it's only one, Texas outlawed lynching by mobs. That's unsanctioned, non-government executions. Lynching by mobs in 1897. The last official lynching occurred in 1968, yet the last unofficial lynching occurred in 1998 to a man named James Byrd. Now, the silliest statement that I've heard has been repeated many, many times, that the Second Amendment was for hunting. Full stop, no, incorrect. The Second Amendment had nothing at all to do with hunting. It had nothing to do with the individual's ability to shoot game, feed their family, to sell the meat and the fur to make a profit. That was, effectively speaking, a de facto thing. That was how you survived during that time period. It was the order of operations as things went. But the ability to protect and defend yourself and your property from threats also. Default, that's how it was. A side note, the militia concept was actually created by King George II, and the purpose was he wanted to make the subjects of the 13 colonies carry more of the weight in defending themselves, because the crown, the British Empire, was still waging wars and taking territory in different parts of the world. So instead of the colonists constantly calling on the king to send more redcoats to help them out against the Native Americans, the indigenous population, and against the French at that time, because England was still fighting with France, King George II thought, hey, a bunch of you citizens get together, get your guns, and get your shit in order, handle your business. Enough of the history lessons, though, for the moment. Let's bring this up to our modern times. We're going to skip past the Black Wall Street Massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. We're going to shoot past the Battle of Athens in Tennessee in 1946. Nobody wants to hear about how Hitler used a pre-existing national gun registry that was put in place after World War I to specifically target Jews, gays, gypsies, and commies from being in possession of firearms back in 1938. Although I can't blame him for the communists. Likewise, we're going to ignore the policies put in place by both Stalin and Mao, leading directly to the slaughter of millions of their own citizens after World War II. That's old news. Even getting into the 1950s with Papa Doc Duvalier in Haiti or Fidel Castro and Che Guevara in Cuba, the tortures, the rapes, and the murders that occurred is something to be left off to the side for the moment. Today we're going to take a quick and honest look, face value, at Afghanistan. Almost 20 years ago, the Taliban governing the body of Afghanistan, which dedicated its time and its resources to keeping its citizens fearful. During those 2 decades that America fought the Taliban, real progress was actually made. Schools were open for children, businesses began to flourish, women enjoyed freedom of movement. I mean, think about that really. Being so oppressed that you are not, as a woman, allowed to go anywhere without either the direct permission or the physical escort of a man. Even if it is your own small 4-year-old child, you can't go anywhere without a man. And through all the horrors of the war that occurred, the citizens still began to prosper. Yet, a few weeks prior to the United States formally and officially withdrawing from the country, the Taliban began systematically encircling many of the provincial cities and key areas, quickly sweeping into the territories the U.S. troops withdrew from. It was like a giant game of red light, green light. Once the final hours of the withdrawal had begun, and we all have seen the videos of those withdrawals in those last few hours and days, the Taliban forces occupied almost every single territory in the entire nation that they had lost control of over the course of 20 years during that war. And their first order of business, to confiscate every single firearm not in the hands of Taliban fighters. We are the Taliban. We are the government. We will protect you. Citizens were disarmed. Individuals that had aided the West, spoke out against the Taliban, were disappeared. Schools were closed, businesses shut down, rights were taken away, and the abuses of power resumed, almost as if they had simply been on a commercial break. Even today, currently, Taliban has implemented more restrictions against women in the country. Now, paraphrasing a statement from our current president, if you want to fight against the government, you're going to need F-15s and missiles. Basically saying that if a government becomes tyrannical and all you have are your AR-15s, you're not going to win. Now, let me take a look at this. Let's just go over this checklist. At the start and the conclusion of the war in Afghanistan, the United States was the world's only superpower, period. The Taliban and the ISIS terrorists did not have these following items. It's not the complete list, but these are the main things. They did not have dedicated satellite communication. They did not have high-altitude loitering surveillance drones. They did not have air-to-air and air-to-ground superiority jet fighters. They did not have air-to-ground combat support helicopters. They did not have a Navy, an Air Force, a Marine Corps, a formal army, no tanks, no mobile artillery, no air support for large supply transports or troop transports, no sea-launched cruise missiles, no armored troop carriers. Nothing except small arms, rifles, grenades, short-range shoulder-launched rockets, and machine guns mounted onto the backs of Toyota pickups. According to our own U.S. military intelligence, the records that were kept, they average an estimate that there were never more than 70 to 75,000 Taliban fighters in any year of the 20 years. That means that no matter how many were captured or killed, on average for 20 years, never more than 75,000 fighters. Flip-flops and bathrobes. For 20 years, the Taliban fought against the world's only superpower and won. Call it how you like it, but it's a win. Somehow, yet, if our government were to turn tyrannical, then we as a citizenry would not bother fighting them. There would be no point. We should just give up our guns. It makes you wonder, just think about it, whose safety are they really concerned for? Ours as a nation or theirs as members of some type of elite social club where we the people are seen more as the hired staff or the guest pass visitors from a Groupon. Side note, most governments go bad when their leadership can and by any means retain their seat of power and their authority and their control over their subjects, over their citizens. If political positions had term limits, as an example, the president has 2 4-year terms. 8 years is the most any president, good, bad, love them, hate them, that's the most that they can serve. Now, hear me out on this. If the U.S. Senate was limited to 3 6-year terms, that's 18 years. If the House of Representatives were limited to 6 two-year terms, that's 12 years. And if the Supreme Court was limited instead of a lifetime position to one 24-year term or age 75, that by itself would be a start. Now, is that a rock-solid guarantee that there will never be any type of despotism in our country? No, absolutely not. And you still have to take into account the enormous number of upper, middle, and lower level bureaucrats in all of the different government departments that they by themselves can have great influence within their appointed areas to push the needle, good or bad, either way that they see fit. But let's continue. Now, the heart of gun control in America stems not from some Americans having more guns than other Americans, or honestly even the type of guns that citizens have access to. It stems from the actions of individuals that choose to do bad things with firearms and the collateral damage that follows. Now, no laws are immutable. Many times what were seen as de facto and just were later deemed to be, at the minimum, unfair to outright morally wrong, such as it is up to us, the people, through the elected legislators, to amend and take care of these issues. Roughly 300 currently enforced federal laws pertaining to firearms. They range from manufacture, distribution, possession, sale, transportation, usage, storage, assembly, modification of, all across the board. Over 10 times that amount, 30,000. No, I'm sorry, 100 times that amount, 30,000 laws by the 50 states collectively. So that's an average of 600 state laws in each state, doubling that 300 for the whole government. So there are plenty of laws to go around, and many of those laws are enforced without hesitation. But the myriad of the other crimes that occur where a firearm might be involved changes the public perception on there aren't enough gun laws. Strictly focusing on my home state, Connecticut, we have strict gun laws and procedures regarding legally acquiring firearms. And many laws in the recent past were loosely subjective in their wording that it allowed a certain level of discrimination against applicants seeking to obtain a firearm permit. That discrimination was purely subjective based upon the municipality and the standard operating procedures of the police department and the city authorities. Now, the authorities couldn't discriminate based upon race, gender, religion, ethnicity, etc., etc. They could just simply find you not suitable, a non-qualifier. As my grandfather used to say, if they don't like the cut of your jib. Presently, and to be fair, for several years since a series of lawsuits, now most municipalities are a bit more objective. Now, getting a firearm legally in Connecticut to keep and bear requires a few basic steps, and I'm summarizing these. Number 1, required firearm safety course to be completed prior to the application. Number 2, submit a properly completed application to your local police. Some police departments, and it's an individual thing, they want character references, they want driving history, they want credit history. You have to have fingerprints, and they do a multi-level verification through their records, state police, FBI. Step 3, you wait. You wait 7 days. You may wait 30 days. That's subjective, again, upon each municipality. Step 4, upon approval, you take your application to the state police headquarters and submit for more fingerprints and more background checks through the federal and state systems. Step 5, you wait. You wait, as I mentioned, 14 days, maybe 45 days, maybe 120 days, and you also have paid for all this up front. So if you're denied, you don't get a refund. Step 6, you're finally issued your permit to purchase and carry within the state of Connecticut. Now, currently, one of the big things is we have state laws that prohibit a large number of firearms, just outright. You can't own that firearm in the state of Connecticut. Most of them are long guns, rifles and shotguns that are semi-automatic and have very specific combinations of features versus the actual function. So even though handguns are still used for 9 out of 10 crimes throughout the state on a regular basis, the focus has always been on the long guns, on the rifles, but we'll circle back around to that. The primary key factor in my state's common sense gun laws is restricting magazine capacity. 10 rounds is the legal maximum capacity of any magazine allowed, unless your magazines are registered with the state police during a specific time period. This was back in 2013. No person shall have a magazine capable of containing more than 10 rounds. Here's a small point on common sense gun law makers. They want their constituents to feel good and to re-elect them, so they offer free smoke up their butts. There's nothing legally prohibiting a person with a valid permit from having multiple handguns on them with dozens of 10-round magazines. And yes, I am invoking the vision of one man, 6 guns from Boondock Saints. Good movie, by the way. I personally carried multiple guns, multiple magazines, concealed on my person just for the ludicrous fun of it. Not making a silent protest against the the dumbass laws, but it goes to the point that they make a law and say this will solve the problem, but it doesn't address it. For most of us, and unfortunately, there's zero difference to a victim whether the mass shooter used one gun and had 4 10-round magazines, or had 4 guns and a backpack and a duffel bag full with magazines. It's zero difference to them. But it does make a difference to the law-abiding citizen who is carrying a firearm and trying to defend themselves, that they are effectively handicapped in this process because they're obeying the law. And while yes, the law says nothing about being able to carry multiple guns and multiple magazines, it's a bit cumbersome and it's a bit of an inconvenience, and it shouldn't be necessary for someone to do just to make sure that they stay protected. Now, many times, just to reiterate, there's a clear difference between passing laws that actually deter criminals from committing crimes and passing laws that simply turn law-abiding citizens into criminals by default. Enforcing the existing laws on actual criminals is where the attention drifts away from. Simply making possession of a manufacturer's standard magazine that holds a specific number of rounds above an arbitrary number that was set by a legislative body is pointless. Making the penalties of committing crimes with guns, regardless of the status of the firearm or the accompanying accessories, should be where the focus is. Many times, the focus on gun control comes down to this: the idea that there will be a massive gun confiscation and law enforcement is going to go door to door seizing firearms from citizens. Partially true. My opinion on that, though, is this is a way that I think it could actually happen. First, it starts with private businesses are encouraged to demand no firearms on premises and immediately notify law enforcement of an individual that they will consider to be a trespasser on their property with a firearm. Municipalities will make ordinances requiring all lawful firearm owners to declare if their residents have firearms and ammunition. Why? Because if there are home burglaries, or there are thieves going around stealing guns, or there's a domestic disturbance at a residence, police need to be aware of this. If there's a fire, the fire department needs to know for their safety if there's ammunition on site. Violations of these ordinances could result in seizing of the firearms until a state-dedicated judge reviews the case and determines the final decision. Second, county, if you have county, and state lawmakers can amend existing laws for other misdemeanors, that if a firearm is present during the minor offense, it does not have to be used, just has to be present, that the offense becomes a felony. And automatic forfeiture of the firearm and potentially all firearms could be taken, as well as jail time. Third, the federal government could implement a new policy of reasonable assessment prior engagement rules. I'll say that again. Reasonable assessment prior engagement rules, where any law enforcement or legislator can notify the federal government if a person, group, or association that is using, trading, building, or modifying any type of firearms or conducting any type of associated training or simulated or real engagement in self-defense with firearms. This would allow any federal agency to actively engage in removal of potential firearms. Lastly, declaration of amnesty, the Feinstein Law, I'm calling it, for former Congresswoman Dianne Feinstein. Turn them all in, Mr. and Mrs. America, fully banning the ownership and possession of firearms. Any and all persons found or reasonably perceived to be in possession of firearms after the surrender deadline will face a mandatory fine of $100,000 or 10 years in federal prison or federal service. Meaning, if you lose your guns in a boating accident and then 2 months later you shoot and kill a home intruder at 2 o'clock in the morning in your living room, you'll be given a choice. Pay $100,000, surrender the equivalent of $100,000. It might be your home, it might be your retirement funds in your 401k, serve 10 years in a federal prison or 10 years doing federal service, which would be defined as any activity that benefits the good of the American people as determined by the federal government. It might be a work camp, maybe a research test subject, maybe cleanup crew in a disaster zone or a war zone. Now, this would not happen all in one calendar week. It would be spread out over months until all the smaller pieces were in place. Then the medium-sized pieces. And then lastly, those big, chunky federal blocks. After that, any door-to-door raids that take place will only be on a handful of people here and there over a few weeks because, one, criminals will still be committing crimes and they will still have their guns. The difference between that is that the criminals will now know you're disarmed. They can afford to do a 10-to-1. We know that there are bad people out there, and the bad people know who they are. We just don't know where or when or how many are coming after us when they do decide. It's sort of like we're the sheep left out in the open field, and we know the wolves are in the tree line. We just can't see them. Now, touching back on my state's understanding of dangerous firearms, the AR-15 platform is prohibited in the state of Connecticut unless you're active duty military, you don't even have to be from the state, a state National Guard member, or law enforcement. However, the state does allow a class of any other weapon that closely resembles a standard AR-15. But yet another firearm, the Ruger Mini 14, chambered in .556, same barrel length, same functionality as an AR-15, is perfectly legal. Simply because the stock of the Ruger Mini 14 does not have a pistol grip that is to the rear and underneath the receiver like the AR-15 does. Subsequently, you can buy an M1A rifle, which is the battle rifle that the U.S. government used through the Korean War and into the first half of the Vietnam War, as is off the shelf just as it was back when it was first designed and first used, an actual weapon of war. Now, magazines are still restricted to 10 rounds, but on a one-to-one basis, if you want to compare the round capability from an AR-15 to the round capability of an M1A, the M1A is a far more lethal and superior firearm. And even though it's not the U.S. military standard rifle anymore, it's still used by the special operations for its high combat effectiveness. I view it as sort of claiming you want to reduce reckless driving deaths, so you ban the Ford Mustang 5.0, but you allow the Dodge Hellcat to travel unmolested on the streets. Yet it still does not address the issue of reckless driving. So with the current level of firearm restrictions in the state of Connecticut, the supporters love to say that gun crimes have gone down significantly. Yet somehow crimes on a monthly basis were committed before and after. You have to look at where was the AR-15. How many crimes before the ban were committed with AR-15s and how many crimes after. Then you have to take a look at how many crimes are committed with semi-automatic handguns before the magazine ban and how many after. And then lastly, how many crimes were committed without a gun at all before the ban versus after. It's a similar thought process when you think about up to 30% of, and I'm going to use these code words because there are certain things that will automatically get this thing flagged as it is. 30% of all unalivings by gun are self-deletions. By eliminating guns, you reduce the self-deleting, which is wrong. You only reduce the unalivings by firearm. Individuals will, as they have sadly for hundreds of people across this country every single month, self-delete by any other means. You just shift those numbers into a different category of self-termination. This is a process that won't be completed overnight. Yet for those of you that are unaware, it has been going on for decades. Each year, more restrictions, caveats are introduced. More citizens wake up to literally find that they are now criminals. They woke up to realize that on this day, whatever day it is, they are now in possession of an item or accessory that they've had for years, but it's now been deemed illegal by a legislator, by some bureaucracy. All this does is it ensures that a smaller and smaller and smaller population has the ability to defend itself. Instead, more people have to rely on the government to protect them from gangs roaming the streets, to protect them from deranged ex-spouses stalking their every move, protecting them from overamped junkies looking for a fix, protect them from aggressive, intolerant individuals with the desire to hurt just because. And of course, you have to rely on the government to protect you from the corrupt and abusive government that seeks to have subjects, servants, and slaves serving its whims instead of citizens being served by their government. On another side note, and this is person specific, if you are an individual that today, last month, or over the last 8 years believes that the 45th president is the embodiment of evil and that he will bring upon a genocide of women, LGBTQ, blacks, Asians, Hispanics, non-Christians, people with blue or green hair, if you adamantly believe he has an army of thugs in the government, in the military, on the streets, waiting to kick in your door, bash in your skull, and do horrible things to you, then you should utterly be opposed to gun control. You should be demanding access to the same type of firearms that you can use to protect you and those you love from that threat. Because if you are thinking about that and you do consider that that is something that you think is a possibility and you are genuinely afraid, then having your ability to keep and bear arms against a tyrannical government is exactly the reason the Second Amendment was written. Now, I don't need to speak to those individuals that understand that any administration can restrict their Second Amendment rights, and even more so now than in the past. More firearm manufacturers will be bogged down in legal actions. Their right to commit lawful commerce will be restricted. The cost of their products will increase, or they'll actually just simply have to shut down and cease operations altogether. With that being said, I'll leave you with this quote, and don't think too deeply into it. Just take it as it is. In this world, there are dangers. You make a choice. Wolf or sheep. Always, always choose wolf. And that's it for now. I'll catch you in the next one.